Thank you. And thanks for being here today. So in the report table today, I noticed there was a phrase around 3 long-standing issues will need to be addressed. And so I'm going to ask a few questions about this bit. So it's first, spending pressures associated with an ageing population. And the Council will publish a long-term stability report in July looking at these issues. Secondly, additional measures could be needed if Ireland is to meet its climate change commitments. And thirdly, the state has become over-reliant on corporation tax receipts, which account for over 18% of annual tax receipts last year. So maybe if we work backwards and start with corporation tax, I'd be interested to know what yourselves believe the correct split of corporation tax should be. And the only way to lower this number is A, through lower corporation tax, or increase other taxes to introduce new taxes. Has the Council given any consideration to how this might be done, or how we might achieve a better balance in terms of corporation tax? And finally, do you believe that there will be any, on the issue of corporation tax, that there will be any impact if we introduce country-by-country reporting?
So on the issue of corporation tax, as Deputy points out, this is a long-standing concern, and it's increased in recent years as the share of taxation coming from corporation tax has increased. In terms of how it's managed, I think there are 2 things. One thing that we've proposed in the past is that unexpectedly positive surprises on corporation tax should be set aside and saved rather than spent, which has been the case over recent years. And that's to avoid the state building up kind of permanent spending commitments on the basis of this tax, which is very volatile and maybe somewhat fragile. I think it also ultimately requires an adjustment downwards, or an adjustment to move away from that. So that either involves reductions in spending elsewhere, or increases in other forms of taxes to reduce that vulnerability. And in terms of and I think one of the vulnerabilities is just that the companies themselves don't do as well, or they decide to move somewhere else, which they could do fairly easily. The other vulnerability is changes in the international tax environment, and that's partly to do with the processes of the OECD BEPS process and a number of these other discussions. So ultimately, it is likely that this will correct, and so it would be good to anticipate it rather than to face this as another economic shock of the sort of shocks that we've seen lately.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, do you take a view on country-by-country reporting?
No, we don't.
So then, to bring you back to that second point around additional measures could be needed if Ireland is to meet its climate change commitments. Obviously, I'm happy to see that cited. But what measures are you referring to there? Is that borrowing? Is that taxes? Is that realignment within sectors?
So I think the climate change is a very important issue for the public finances. If climate change isn't addressed, there's a potential cost in terms of mitigation, particularly in terms of flooding, but a number of other costs that will be related to that. And also, if nothing is done, there's the cost that a more violent and costly adjustment will be needed down the way. So taking policy measures in this area is just from a public finance perspective, leaving aside all the benefits it has in terms of making life on this planet more sustainable, is a very important thing to do. Now, in terms of the impact in public finances, that there are some positive impacts. So some of this could be achieved, for example, by higher environmental taxes, such as the carbon tax, or through charges and things like that. And also adapting, doing the transition to a low carbon economy could create activity in the economy, which will create employment and tax revenues in that way. So it's not a wholly negative story for the public finances. But there are also some areas where investment, particularly public investment, would be needed to achieve those objectives, and where potentially incentives might need to be provided. And in that case, that will be at the cost to the state, and that needs to be factored into the state's plans. And I think in some ways it's very helpful that there's now a clearer target in this area, and hopefully the economic plans can be aligned to make sure that can be achieved in a way that is effective, but is also consistent with the sustainability of the public finances. And
then to bring you back to the very first point that you cited, that there will be spending pressures associated with an ageing population, and you're publishing a long-term stability report. Is there a resolution to the financial pressures around an ageing population other than a long-term project around pensions, or what can we expect to see in that report?
Michael? Yeah. So I think you'll see the report when it comes out. But the point we're going to try and make is really not to, as is always our position, not to tell policymakers what they should do to address it, but to highlight some of the issues. And in particular, the two big increases that we're going to highlight are on both social protection and health spending. The pressures that will grow over the next 30 years are going to be quite substantial. Numbers of the order of, if you add those two together, about 8% of GNI. So if you think that these are government spending commitments that will have to be met, then the decision has to be made either to raise funds from another source to make up for that spending, or to cut spending in another area. And I think the key point about these is these are relatively slow-moving, easily predictable trends. So the sooner you take action, you can take small bits of action over long periods to mitigate the effects of these on the fiscal position. And that's, I think, the key point that we're going to sort of draw out in that report.